Our world appears to be captured within a cave of limited imagination when thinking about the future. Despite the incredible abundance which we could create, the only acceptable discussions about the future of humanity showcase a belief that scarcity, war, and poverty are the only future which we should expect. In this episode of our series, we will evaluate the principled fallacies of this belief in scarcity, limited resources, and overpopulation. We will do so by exposing several pseudo-scientific beliefs that are currently holding humanity back from an age of freedom, creativity, and cooperation. It is common in our modern day and age to hear the phrase zero-sum, that we live in a world that is governed by limited resources, and that for one group to gain a bigger piece of the so-called pie, there must in turn be another group that loses a piece of the pie. This scenario is often referred to as a game. That is, that we live in a zero-sum game where the players must weigh the costs and benefits in operating within such a framework. This theory of zero-sum first originated with the advent of game theory, the mathematical theory of games of strategy developed by John von Neumann according to his book Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, which he co-authored with Oscar Morgenstern. The crux of game theory is that an individual's behavior will always be motivated towards achieving an optimal outcome, which is determined by selfish self-interest. That for one player to maximize their payoff, it must come at the cost of the other players.
We have to prepare for a more angry world.
Today, much of the world is governed by this very theory. We are now at a point where it is considered by many to be essential, if not at the very core of what dictates and models our economic, political, sociological, as well as military behaviors and outcomes, and is taught as such in many prestigious universities as something pretty much set in stone. This approach to understanding systems began in the early 1970s as the Club of Rome popularized the notion that the entire world, which included all resources, population, farmland, and pollution, could be measured using linear computer models. These models, which all assumed that we lived in a zero-sum world, would be used to extrapolate trends into the future, paying no consideration to humanity's ability to problem solve via technological innovation.
It's not some science fantasy effect from 2001. This electronic display emanating from Australia's largest computer is a picture of the condition, past, present and future of planet Earth. The condition of the planet starts to become highly critical, and if we don't do anything about it, this is what's going to happen. The quality of life is going to go right back to practically zero.
But can we be certain that we do live in a zero-sum world governed by limited resources and selfish self-interests? Is this truly all that we are left with at the end of the day of what decides the political and economic policies that will affect the welfare of billions of lives on this planet? After all, it is acknowledged by the theorists themselves that the entire functioning of their mathematical model relies upon the assumption that we are governed by selfishness, and that they feel confident about this assumption since reality has apparently confirmed this fact to them. But what if humanity's nature were shaped by something else entirely? And what if the resources contained in our environment were not as limited as von Neumann supposed? How can we know what is true? How can we know what kind of a person we truly are and not how we have been encouraged to think of ourselves within the framework of a mathematical game? This may be counterintuitive to some, but the hypothesis of a theory must always precede the actual mathematical model. The variables you choose, how you define the variables, and their relationships to one another is not being defined by the model, but rather the creator of said model. Once the mathematical model is created, it can now theoretically add to that beginning structure and mimic a simplified version of reality. However, we should keep in mind that a model that has been created on a false hypothesis could still technically function. Such a model is not self-aware that it is not a representation of reality and cannot indicate so to its creator. Thus, a mathematical model can be a representation of a simplified reality, or it can represent a completely artificial reality. Such an artificial reality nearly destroyed the world economy in 2008, as those computer models relying on statistical probability theory and casino logic of gambling resulted in a systemic breakdown, as demonstrated in the 2016 film The Big Short. At the beginning of von Neumann's book, he goes through several disclaimers which are highly problematic towards the relevance of his theory, one of them being the acknowledgement that there exists at present no satisfactory treatment of the question of rational behavior. There may, for example, exist several ways by which to reach the optimum position. They may depend upon the knowledge and understanding which the individual has, and upon the paths of action open to them, because they imply, as must be evident, quantitative relationships. As becomes rapidly evident, von Neumann makes endless assertions such as these in his book, as if they were obvious and thus need no further examination at all. The assumption that an underdefined, rational, selfish behavior is merely quantifiable and nothing more, and does not account for qualitative change, a mathematician's worst nightmare, is taking great liberty in oversimplifying human behavior to conveniently fit his mathematical model. In other words, it is not an accurate model. You are manipulating the definitions and interactions of your variables to fit an artificial reality. This problem continues today with how mathematical models can represent an artificial reality that in fact has no application in the actual world we live in. In fact, when we look at how a so-called limited resource is being defined, a term that is largely taken for granted today, we immediately are hit with some rather large problematic inconsistencies in even defining what is a limited resource at its most basic level. For instance, what fundamentally determines the limit to a resource? Is a specific resource something that is fixed in its amount, in its availability on Earth that remains unchanged for all time? That is, can a resource only be used up, or can it also be reproduced, regenerated? Obviously, if a resource can be regenerated, then the limit to that specific resource will be determined by the rate it is used versus the rate it is able to be replenished. All resources that are essential to life, including human life, are naturally renewable. There is a natural cycle that causes these resources to be regenerated. This includes the natural cycles of water, oxygen, vegetation, and so forth. Thus, everything that is essential for life is already naturally renewable on Earth. The concern is thus that we are using these resources too quickly with the rate of human population growth, such that these renewable resources will become scarce, causing us to reach a point where the collapse of civilization and rapid depopulation will be inevitable due to extreme scarcity in these essential resources, not to mention the effects this will have on other life forms on Earth. This point of catastrophe is calculated as the point when the human population will exceed its carrying capacity. However, what determines the carrying capacity? Thomas Malthus himself, who was the one to create the Malthusian growth model, never actually specified an exact number for when the human population would hit its carrying capacity. This was because it was understood that the carrying capacity is not something fixed, but could be increased or decreased depending on human-made innovations such as agriculture. In 1790, Thomas Malthus did make the prophecy that we would hit our carrying capacity 100 years into the future, meaning, according to Malthus, we should have experienced mass famine and starvation by the year 1890, causing the world to decrease to more than half its size, which, needless to say, was very much off the mark. It should be noted that Malthus was fully convinced that his prophecy was accurate and that the only way to avoid such a catastrophe was to severely curb the growth of the human population immediately. This included the denial of medical care and food to the needy, since it was thought by the followers of Malthus that the postponement of their death would only use up further resources without any contribution to society. The reason why Malthus was so far off the mark was because such a point in the future concerning the human carrying capacity cannot be determined by a linear extrapolation. This is because, as already mentioned, human innovations change our relationship to the resources we use in a qualitative manner and not just a quantitative manner. Qualitative change has always been the mathematician's worst nightmare in producing models that will supposedly predict trends in the future. How can a mathematical model predict all qualitative change that will happen in the future? Is it even possible? This is something really important to keep in mind. There is no specific agreed-upon optimal number for the human population. Such a number can only be fixed if we were to have absolutely no change in our societies alongside a growing population. But we do have change, and that is everything. Human innovations have so far, and continue, to not only increase the quantity of resources produced, but we have also made qualitative changes such as increasing diversity and efficiency in the biosphere itself. For instance, many of the basic foods we eat today were created through human-made innovations such as corn, apples, watermelons, bananas, peaches, carrots, and eggplants, just to name a few examples of the wide array of foods we consume today that are highly nutritious due to the very reason of human innovation. Without human innovation, our foods would contain a small fraction of the nutrition that they do today, if they had been left as they were found by nature. Even livestock did not exist in the form they do today, if it had not been for human-made innovations. These innovations go back for centuries, well before we knew anything about the genetic domain. The ability to not only grow our own food, but to increase its efficiency in nutrition is a very important ability that has made it possible to sustain ever more people on Earth with a higher quality of life. There is also the concern over limited space. We have a finite amount of space on Earth, this is true, and thus there is only so much space to support a decent standard of living and in harmony with other life forms on Earth. Many think we are fast approaching the dystopic visions that have been heavily pumped into our stream of consciousness, such as these. Isn't this inevitable? After all, there is only so much room, and the poor will only be able to afford the smallest living spaces as land becomes an increasingly scarce resource. Not to mention, how will this affect our capability to grow food if space becomes severely limited? Can any kind of ecosystem or habitat coexist with us at that point? This will be difficult for many to wrap their heads around, since not only are such dystopic predictions everywhere in our entertainment sphere, but also there is a very real problem with how some modern cities are being built today. Let us first deal with the question of how much space we currently have, and then move on to this question of how cities should choose to organize themselves such that the standard of living can actually increase with population growth rather than decrease. Here is an example where we can fit the entire human population all into one-story townhouses back-to-back in just the state of Texas. We wouldn't even need to build two-story townhouses. So we are nowhere near running out of actual space presently, and it won't be until much, much further into the future that such a thing would start to even become a concern. And by then, who knows what kind of capabilities we will have. Suffice to say, it is not a crisis now and won't be for hundreds of years, if ever. Another concern is, will we run out of space for food production? According to the USDA, the world is increasing its rate of food productivity in relation to the rate of human population growth. And according to Our World in Data, the amount of space required to grow our food is decreasing due to increased efficiency. Looking at this USDA graph, we can see that in comparison to the population growth between 1960, 1980, 2000, and today, our rate of food production has been increasing. Thus, not only do we have more than plenty of space to fit the human population on Earth, but we also find that our world food production is increasing in relation to population growth, and the amount of space required to produce this food has decreased. So we are presently nowhere near hitting our carrying capacity. What we are seeing presently is a lack of essential resources such as food and water in localized regions. There is not a shortage of food production occurring. We are and do have the capability of producing enough food for the entire world population. The reason why certain areas are suffering from critical shortages are due to political and economic reasons, which we will discuss in further detail in another episode. In terms of the argument for overcrowding in certain cities of the world, as you can see, India, Eastern Asia, primarily Japan, China, and South Korea, and in Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo are among the most densely populated areas in the world. The common conception is that if you have that sort of population density, you have no choice but to have overcrowding in your cities. However, as we saw with the previous example, if we can fit the world population into Texas with a townhouse each, then the top countries in population size are not really overcrowded. The issue is more so, especially in the areas of Africa and India, a question of living standard. It is also a question of how cities with large populations are organized. Tokyo holds one of the largest population sizes of any city in the world at 39.1 million. However, if you have ever visited Tokyo, you would quickly appreciate the numerous large, beautiful parks interspersed throughout the city. Cities such as Tokyo, as well as Seoul, Shanghai, and Beijing, are also beginning to incorporate trees along the streets and even on top of buildings in their city centers. Seoul in South Korea holds a population of 26 million people, the largest city in South Korea. Here are some examples of how Seoul has incorporated trees and parks throughout the city. The population of the city Shanghai proper is the third largest in the world, with 26.8 million inhabitants, while the urban area is the most populous in China, with 39.3 million residents. With such a population density, many in the West who are not used to such things think the living standard must be a lot lower. However, what we would see if we actually visited Shanghai is that it is actually quite a nice city. Here is a picture of Century Park, the largest park in Shanghai at 346 acres. China actually takes it very seriously to have a balance between their rapid city growth and the need to include parks and trees so that there is a connection to nature. If you have ever visited China, this is one thing that immediately stands out. Many of these parks are not the average run-of-the-mill either. They are made following the philosophy of feng shui, which includes the idea that a park should invoke deeper reflection and a profound connection to nature. This philosophy is also shared by the Japanese and the Korean people. Chongqing is the only city in China with a population of over 30 million and can claim to be the largest city proper in the world. Chongqing is the fourth largest Chinese city by urban population, with an urban population of 22 million after Shanghai, Beijing, and Shenzhen. Chongqing Central Park in the city's Yubai district is said to be the largest urban public park in Asia and the third largest in the world after New York's Central Park and London's Hyde Park. Chongqing also has beautiful national parks such as the Wulong National Park. In fact, China is full of beautiful national parks such as the Zhangjiajie National Forest Park, the Huanglong National Park, and the Tianmen Mountain National Park, to name just a few. In comparison, let us look at what the population density for Canada looks like. Needless to say, we are nowhere near running out of space for people. And China has shown that cities can still be beautiful with an increasing living standard alongside a high population density and living in harmony with nature. In addition, we see that countries such as China and India, with among the highest population densities in the world, are also among the greenest regions on Earth. This has largely been due to China and India's decision to implement human-made forests. One of the reasons why this was done was to address pollution problems, since trees are excellent air purifiers. They also happen to be great consumers of carbon dioxide. Large regions of greenery also make for excellent temperature control. In fact, much of these areas were previously desert. This also shows that large ecosystems can thrive in regions with high population densities. Some of the largest human-made forests include the Saihamba Forest in China. This human-made forest is larger than the size of France, atop the once barren Qinghai Tibet Plateau, and covers 270 square miles. Located 280 miles from the Chinese capital, it is called the Green Lung of Beijing. The Malai Forest in India. Popularly known as the Forest Man of India, Jadav Payung is a man who single-handedly planted an entire forest on a barren wasteland. Bothered by the constant animal deaths, the land erosion, and the lack of trees, he decided to take matters into his own hands by planting an entire forest on his own, one that spans over 1,360 hectares today. The Chungamanga Forest in Pakistan. Spanning over a massive 12,423 acres, this forest reserve was established in 1866. Yes, it is the oldest human-made forest in the world. Johannesburg. With more than 10 million trees all around, this is the largest human-made urban forest in the world. By invoking better temperature control, we also decrease the occurrence of extreme weather phenomena. Planting green vegetation is an excellent way to keep water inland and not lose it to the oceans or underground. It is also, as already mentioned, excellent at regulating global temperature and thus reducing extreme fluctuations in climate. For example, the Sahara Desert is responsible for a lot of the hurricane activity that hits the eastern coast of the United States. This is due to the rapid temperature change from very hot to very cool air currents that travel over the Sahara, followed by the Atlantic Ocean. The Sahara was once a land of luscious greenery. By returning the Sahara to this previous state, we will dramatically decrease the number and degree of storms hitting the North American East Coast. Planting forests also help to reduce the destructive effects of sandstorms. Sandstorms can cause a lot of damage to city centers, costing up to millions of dollars in repairs, money that could be much better spent elsewhere. Transportation of vital resources is also greatly slowed down by this. And sandstorms can cause serious, prolonged periods of air pollution in cities, which cause numerous deaths a year. Palm trees are very good for greening desert regions. They provide shade, they work as a windshield, and can stabilize the soil. They also provide food. In addition, the shade provided can allow for other crops that are less heat-resistant to grow more efficaciously. The Serapian forest in Egypt has managed to plant trees in the desert using wastewater. The Serapian forest, which has boomed despite the drought and rainfall deficit, consists of 200 hectares of trees planted in Ismaila city in northeast Egypt and has set a precedent for other African countries. China has also made an immense success in greening its deserts with robust tree planting and have succeeded in changing desert ecosystems to sustain green life over the long term. The Loess Plateau, located southeast of the Gobi Desert, is one of China's biggest success stories in the greening of deserts. Over the course of 9,500 years of unsustainable agriculture, this plateau was slowly turned into a lifeless desert which could no longer support the population. However, within a matter of 1 decade, this area was transformed into abundant green regenerative farming by the use of permaculture. The government launched mass education programs for farmers while providing the resources and incentives needed to transform the land. Additionally, farmers were given ownership of their own land, new planting techniques, and wide-yield terraces were built to secure the soil and improve crop productivity. Vegetation cover and sediment control increased through the protection of arable land areas. Through these bold reforms, soil erosion was decreased by 60 tons per year, resulting in better standards and prices of the crops. Since this project was begun, approximately 2.5 million people have been lifted out of poverty, making the Loess Plateau one of the greatest sustainable farming stories in the world. If this project were continued in other parts of the world, a revolution in freedom of producers, increased bounty of land, transformation of deserts to rich green areas would occur in short order. This project's success demonstrates that an increased well-being to the health of nature, the productivity of a nation, and the freedom of the citizen can all grow together in harmony. In 1872, Henry C. Carey, Lincoln's economic advisor, would write in his book titled Unity of Law, Crusoe, having made a bow, had thus acquired wealth, that wealth exhibiting itself in the power obtained over certain natural properties of wood and muscular fiber, thereby enabling him to secure increased supplies of food with greatly diminished expenditure of labor. Having made a canoe, he found his wealth much increased, his new machine enabling him to obtain still further increase of food and of the raw materials of clothing at still decreased cost of personal effort. Erecting a pole on his canoe, he now commands the services of wind, and with each and every step in this direction finds himself advancing with constantly accelerated rapidity toward becoming master of nature and a being of real wealth and power. Does this sound like the description of a limited resource zero-sum game scenario? In other words, where is the set limit? The limit is constantly being readjusted to what the individual creates, which changes his or her relationship to the utility of the resource. For example, the resource wood, depending on the individual's innovation, can be used to keep one warm and dry, cook food, create torches, create shelter, or create a ship for travel, etc.
2, 1.
The existence of yet-to-be-created potential thus offsets the entire system of von Neumann because his system has no way of predicting potential, in other words, qualitative transformations, nor how this will affect human behavior. If you cannot predict future qualitative change, which is ongoing, such as the discovery of electricity, or the creation of man-made plutonium and other transuranic elements, or the potential waiting to be unlocked by the very feasible fusion plasma torch that can turn landfills into resource mines, this will be discussed in detail in a later episode. How can you assume a defined set limit, or even a defined zero-sum game as a self-evident truth, when you cannot even predict what is the said limit? Ironically, in his book, von Neumann likens his pioneering work in the field of game theory to what physicists have been doing for centuries, that is, mathematical formulations that represent, albeit simplified, the laws of nature concerning matter and energy. However, von Neumann again showcases that he has no comprehension of what constitutes the foundation for such laws of nature. By von Neumann acknowledging that he himself is heavily relying on his so-called self-evident truths in simplifying human behavior, he is asserting an outcome. He is not proving the outcome's natural occurrence. In von Neumann's book, he refers to the greatest good for the greatest possible number as a contradiction because, according to von Neumann, you cannot maximize two or more functions at once. That in a social economy, all maxima are desired at once by various players and thus must come at a loss for the whole. That is, there is no concept that it is possible to cooperate and share an optimal outcome without it coming out of your share, so to speak, that comes at a cost of having less instead of more. This is a very narrow and limited understanding of economy, and again does not account for how cooperation and creative potential can work to transform the goods of an outcome. For instance, country A is militarily stronger than country B, which is rich in many raw resources. Country A is also stronger politically than country B in that there are no other countries that will likely intervene against country A's actions if it chooses to invade country B. What course of action will yield the greatest return to country A? Well, there's a very obvious answer to that question. However, contrary to popular thought, it will not yield the greatest optimal outcome. The greatest optimal outcome is rather to cooperate. It is both in country A and country B's best interest to share knowledge, even if country A has much more knowledge, such that country B develops the capability to refine its raw resources. By doing so, country B will yield a greater return in trade over the long term to country A, and country A does not have to worry about a future retaliation from country B. By developing a more advanced economy, the wealth that comes from trade is increased for both countries. By cooperation, the optimal outcome is transformed and offers a greater return than if either country simply looked out for their own interests. John von Neumann goes on to state in his book that the more players in the model, the easier it is to predict the outcome, since the use of statistics and probability are increasingly better indicators of behavior and performance. He states, "When the number of participants becomes really great, meaning in number, some hope emerges that the influence of every particular participant will become negligible and that the above difficulties may recede and a more conventional theory become possible. These are, of course, the classical conditions of free competition. He goes on to use the example of our solar system with its 9 major bodies as being much harder to model than 10 to the 25th freely moving gas particles, as per gas theory, simply due to the sheer number of objects you are dealing with. This is truly a remarkably absurd statement where von Neumann is asserting that if the solar system had more major bodies orbiting within it, it would thus be easier to model based off of probability. Every planet in our solar system is different in size and weight, with a different number of moons. Every planet revolves around the Sun in imperfect elliptical orbits that change slowly over time. The fact is that our solar system is not some perfectly closed system that is uniform and consistent in its actions. There are cyclical changes, but there are also non-cyclical changes that are occurring. This is due to our solar system orbiting around a galactic center of the Milky Way, which is itself moving in yet-to-be-discovered ways within a larger cluster of galaxies. Therefore, you cannot use any theory of probability because the system is in a state of ongoing, non-linear change. The more bodies you add to such a system, the more complex it becomes, not the more predictable through probability projections. Such an oversimplification of nature shows the audacity behind the assumptions that make up such formulations like game theory, where we are encouraged to think of ourselves as nothing more than a virtual avatar within a synthetic world with programmed limits to what we can and cannot do within such a game. Game theory does not represent the motivations behind human nature, but rather imposes such limitations, since as they acknowledge themselves, it is easier to predict and control your chosen selfish behaviors, which are encouraged and rewarded with incentives. We are taught never to question the rules given to us in these game theory scenarios, but to react to what has been defined to us as a limited set of options in an artificial scenario. Thus, we find that this concept of limited resource and thus zero-sum game is a rather misleading term, since it makes the assumption that growth will occur with no qualitative change. From Malthus to von Neumann and the modern ecology movement, there is a pervasive, uncreative claim that our future can be nothing other than a dismal extrapolation of artificial limitations, despite the evidence of all human history showing a contrary picture. It is time we break ourselves free from the curse of game theory. In our next episode, we will discuss how various forms of energy function and what are the differences in how energy is produced in terms of efficacy, cost, and waste management. This will be discussed in relation to the EU and US policies to reach a carbon net zero by the year 2050.